Would you shock someone to death just because someone in a lab coat told you to? In 1961, as the world watched Nazi officer Adolf Eichmann defend his role in the Holocaust by claiming he was just following orders, a Yale psychologist named Stanley Milgram wondered, would ordinary Americans also harm innocent people simply because an authority figure commanded it? The answer would shock the world and reveal a disturbing truth about human nature that remains relevant today. Milgram, who was Jewish himself, designed what appeared to be a straightforward experiment about learning and memory. Participants would be paid $4, about $40 in today's money, for just 1 hour of their time. These weren't unusual people. They were ordinary adults from New Haven, taxi drivers, teachers, salespeople, the kind of folks you'd meet anywhere in America. When participants arrived at Yale University, they met another volunteer, actually an actor working for Milgram. Through a rigged drawing, the real participant always became the teacher, while the actor became the learner. The teacher watched as the learner was strapped into a chair with electrodes attached to his arm. The learner even mentioned having a heart condition, making sure the teacher understood the potential danger. The teacher was then led to another room containing what appeared to be an electric shock generator. This imposing machine had 30 switches labeled from 15 volts to 450 volts, with descriptions ranging from slight shock to danger, severe shock. The final switches were simply marked XXX, suggesting they might be lethal. A stern experimenter in a gray lab coat explained the rules. The teacher would read word pairs to the learner. If the learner made a mistake, the teacher had to administer an electric shock, increasing the voltage with each error. To convince the teacher the shocks were real, they received a mild 45-volt sample shock before beginning. What the teachers didn't know was that no actual shocks were delivered. The learner's increasingly distressed responses were pre-recorded. As the supposed voltage increased, these recordings became more alarming. At 75 volts, the learner grunted in discomfort. By 150 volts, he pleaded to be released, mentioning his heart condition. Around 300 volts, he screamed, "Let me out of here! You have no right to hold me here." After 330 volts, the learner fell completely silent, suggesting he might be unconscious or worse. When teachers hesitated or expressed concern, the experimenter used a series of escalating prompts. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Before conducting the experiment, Milgram asked colleagues to predict how many people would go all the way to the maximum 450-volt shock. Most experts, including Milgram himself, guessed that only about 1% of participants, the most sadistic outliers, would comply fully. They believed the vast majority would refuse once the learner showed signs of distress. The actual results were stunning. Every single participant, all 40 of them, continued to at least 300 volts, even after the learner begged to be released. And a shocking 65% of participants went all the way to the maximum 450-volt level, administering what they believed were potentially lethal shocks to an unresponsive victim. This wasn't easy for them. Many teachers showed extreme distress, sweating, trembling, biting their lips, laughing nervously. One even had a seizure so severe the experiment had to be stopped. Yet despite their obvious moral qualms, most continued to follow orders. Why would ordinary people with no history of violence or cruelty inflict such apparent suffering on an innocent stranger? Milgram described this as an agentic state, a mindset where people view themselves merely as instruments carrying out someone else's wishes. In this state, they transfer responsibility for their actions to the authority figure giving the orders. This explains why many participants, while visibly upset, would say things like, "I have to do this," or "the experiment requires it." They had shifted moral responsibility to the experimenter. They were just following orders, the very defense used by Eichmann and other Nazis on trial. Milgram's findings challenged a comforting assumption many Americans held after World War II, that the Holocaust was possible only because of something uniquely obedient in German culture. His research suggested that the capacity for blind obedience exists in all of us. The line between ordinary people and perpetrators of atrocities might be much thinner than we'd like to believe. The experiment became one of the most famous in the history of psychology, partly because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. What would I have done in that situation? Most of us believe we would refuse to harm an innocent person regardless of who was giving the orders. But Milgram's data suggests otherwise. Ironically, while revealing ethical weaknesses in human behavior, the experiment itself raised serious ethical concerns. Participants experienced extreme stress and deception. Many believed they might have seriously hurt or even killed someone. The controversy around Milgram's methods helped establish stronger ethical standards for research, including informed consent, minimizing deception, and allowing participants to withdraw at any time. Despite these ethical concerns, the findings have proven remarkably durable. Modern replications with ethical safeguards consistently find high rates of obedience. In 2010, a French television show recreated the experiment as a fake game show, where 81% of contestants were willing to deliver what they thought were lethal shocks when encouraged by a host and audience. The implications extend far beyond the laboratory. Milgram's research helps explain how ordinary people participate in everything from war crimes to corporate scandals. It reminds us that situations and systems can override individual moral compasses. As Milgram himself wrote, his experiment reveals the ease with which ordinary people can become agents of harm when commanded by an authority. But Milgram's work isn't entirely pessimistic. Remember, 35% of participants did eventually refuse to continue, despite intense pressure. These resistors demonstrate that defying destructive authority is possible, and understanding the power of authority is the first step toward developing resistance to it. By recognizing our vulnerability to authority influence, we can be more vigilant when someone in a position of power asks us to violate our values. The next time you face pressure to do something that feels wrong, remember Milgram's experiment. Ask yourself whether you're slipping into an agentic state where you've transferred responsibility to someone else. Remember that "I was just following orders" has never been accepted as a moral defense. Not at the Nuremberg trials and not in the court of your own conscience. What situation in your life has made you uncomfortable but you went along with it anyway because someone in authority told you to? Milgram's shocking experiment remains relevant today because it reminds us that freedom requires vigilance, not just against tyrannical governments, but against our own deeply ingrained tendency to obey destructive authority. The real lesson may be that moral courage is less common than we'd like to believe, but more necessary than we often realize.